one of the most misunderstood things is that universities aren't innovative. I think they are dealing with lots of challenges and complexity, but they want to innovate, they want to change, they want to evolve. Sometimes people think they don't want to, but I think they do. I think there's a strong appetite for that in the university sector.
Hello and welcome to the Emerge Product Market Fit Academy series, where we're joined by leading operators and founders in edtech to share practical insights and guidance for early stage founders. If you're building the future of learning and work, then this is for you. I'm Zara and I'm joined by our guest today, Chris Hale. Now, Chris has extensive senior level experience working in higher education policy and strategy, with over 20 years in the UK higher education sector and working in policy roles. Until recently, Chris was the Director of Policy at UniversitiesUK, the national body for universities, also spending some time there as interim CEO. In these roles, Chris worked to support closer university engagement with edtech startups and facilitate the adoption of edtech into universities' strategic thinking. On this, he's worked with us at Emerge for several years. Chris has also recently relocated to New Zealand and is currently working on strategy implementation at the University of Otago. Welcome, Chris. Maybe you can kick it off with sharing a little bit about what strategy implementation covers.
Yeah, great. Very happy to. Thanks for that introduction, Sarah. So University of Otago have got a new strategy. One of the strap lines is they want to be a better version of themselves. So it's about how they know what they want to be, but they want to do it really well and really effectively. But universities are big, complex organizations, as you probably know, and it requires quite a lot of coordination to actually make some of that strategy, some of those objectives of that strategy happen. So it's about identifying what some of the priority projects and activities might be to help them implement that strategy, and then working to coordinate people to embed those and push those forwards. I think it's also about trying to align planning to make sure that discussions around planning and budgeting and all those things line up with the strategy. So you've got a sort of golden thread from the sort of operational activities right through to your big strategic ideas about where the direction of the university wants to go. And it's really interesting. It's a great university, but it's also very challenging because they're big, complex, diverse places, and they've got a very unique culture as well, universities. So it's about trying to kind of work with that as well.
Very exciting, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the unique and complex structures of universities later in this discussion. Today, we have a lineup of 3 key topics to discuss, focusing on how higher education startups can better serve universities. So firstly, we're going to ask, what are the top challenges on universities' minds at the moment and how startups can help them respond to these challenges? Secondly, we'll talk about what founders should be aware of when operating in a regulated environment like higher education. And finally, we'll talk about what the best way for startups is to navigate their way into a university. Diving straight into the first topic, what are the top 3 challenges on universities' minds at the moment?
I'll start off with the first one, but perhaps before I say that, I've been in New Zealand for about 9 months now, and most of my experience is around UK universities, so I'll probably talk mostly about those. But what I'll do is try and give some reflections on what's going down here in New Zealand, on Australia, and down in the Pacific as well. On the more negative, challenging side of things, my first challenge that I'd outline would be the financial squeeze on resources that we've seen in universities over the years, and particularly in the UK, but we're seeing it here in New Zealand as well. Inflation's been eroding the overall value of the unit of resource per student that universities get. I think in the UK, the headline fee, although it's £9,000, it's actually the value of that, because it's not been adjusted for inflation, is around about £6,000 now. And I think that was a figure that Universities UK put out there. So we've seen expansion over the last 10 years or so, but we've seen a decrease in the unit of resource. So on the university's minds will be how they manage in that situation. I think there's lots of discussions about how that can be resolved, and there's big sort of political discussions, I think, that need to happen there. And we're probably unlikely to see a real big solution come in the next sort of few years. So I think the big issue on universities' minds is how they remain competitive within that environment. How do they maintain quality of what they do? Thinking very carefully about what they do. I think a priority for them will be to maintain quality, the student experience, without significant or new investments. And I think where I think startups and founders can help is helping identify and supporting solutions in those areas. That might be around process and internal improvements, better and more effective use of data, solutions supporting students, helping students navigate cost of living, some of those kind of challenges which universities are facing at the moment. Because I think universities want to do more on that, but again, they're constrained with resources. And I think other issues about how you can support student engagement, assessment, support development and innovative new modes of delivery, because that's something that I think universities are very interested in looking at. Even though there may be constraints on their resources, I think they are still looking to innovate, particularly more flexible, modular forms of delivery as well.
Thanks for that overview, Chris. Particularly focused on that financial squeeze on resources within universities, but pulling out these key threads of how universities remain competitive, how they maintain quality in the student experience, student engagement, assessment modes, delivery. So you touched on a lot of different issues there. I'd love to dive a little level deeper and look at how startups can really help them respond to these challenges. What are some examples of really good solutions you've seen?
As you will know, there are many organisations and startups that are helping and working with universities on some of those challenges. I think some of the work that's going on around assessment, particularly, I think is really good. I think that's enabling and supporting universities to help navigate some of the challenges they've got, particularly about how they respond to the challenges of AI. And obviously, many universities see that as an opportunity, but I think they want to be able to think about and manage some of the risks there. And we see a number of startups in that space that are really helping universities understand and support some of the issues and challenges they've got there. And particularly doing that in helping them build on some of the systems and processes they've got, rather than creating lots of big new architecture and things that they need to be spending lots of money on.
Super interesting to see assessment is a key area, particularly responding to the challenges of AI and really building on the existing structures within universities rather than spending a lot of money on creating new ones. Love to know which are the areas that you haven't seen as much innovation, where you think there is a gap for edtech to step into to support universities on challenges they are facing.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think one of the challenges in universities is that different areas can be quite siloed. Universities can collect data, and often that's not coordinated. And I think some startups will be helping universities in particular areas, whether it's around assessment or whether it's around employer engagement or it's other activities. And I think there is something about how startups can potentially be working with universities to get better at joining up and thinking about how they use some of their data strategically and open that up and open up some of those silos, and particularly thinking about what that might mean for the student experience. And I think there have obviously been developments around things like the smart university. And I think those kind of developments and those areas could be really beneficial, not only for students, but I think also for staff. So I think, yes, areas where you can be looking at data across the university and breaking down some of those silos to add real value to students and staff.
Super interesting. Absolutely. It's something I've heard from a few different university leaders, that it can be difficult to connect the different systems and avoid silos within such a big ecosystem. Speaking of the ecosystem, would love to know what founders should be aware of when they're operating in a regulated environment like higher education. What are the things that founders maybe misunderstand or would really benefit them if they understood in terms of the inner workings of universities?
I think for better or worse, universities are now operating in a very highly regulated environment. In England, they have the Office for Students now, but there's also professional regulators. They've got the Home Office that they're thinking about in relation to international students. There's charity and statutory regulation, as well as things like freedom of information, regulation of data, and use and reuse of data through things like GDPR, which everyone is obviously subject to. I think the downside of that for universities is the complexity, the burden, and often some of the regulatory requirements can be quite opaque. And I think for large organizations that are quite diverse, I think navigating those landscapes can be quite challenges. So I think sometimes it can make universities a little risky as they look to think about how they comply and how they think about some of those requirements. The upside, I think, and maybe universities don't always see it in this way because they often will sort of groan under sort of all the regulation they have to deal with, but it does give them the impetus to push things forward in certain areas. So, for example, the regulatory focus on things like consumer protection and student experience that we've seen through the Office for Students in England means that universities now have to be thinking really carefully about what they do in those areas and how they do it, and bring it really into the center of their thinking. And there's also a focus on things like addressing student mental health, creating more inclusive, safer learning environments, making sure universities are focused on their role in terms of equality of access and driving opportunity and those kind of things. So I think those are obviously areas where actually founders are all, and edtech startups are all operating and helping provide solutions. But I think some of the things that you probably need to be aware of in that context is, I think, making time to consider some of those requirements, knowing who some of those regulators are and what they're asking universities to do, because I think that will really help understand what's on universities' minds. And I think if you're looking at, for example, if you're looking to work with an English university, take a look at the OFS website, understand what the broad level of some of those requirements are, things like the Teaching Excellence Framework, what that's asking universities to do. And I think it's quite important to understand that, because those things will be really prominent in universities' minds. And I think the other thing to remember as well is, I've talked a lot about England, but whilst we've got a broadly recognisable HE sector in the UK, there is difference between England, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland as well. So if you're operating in those different jurisdictions, it's important to sort of think, well, actually, universities will be under a different set of regulations. And often the changes can be subtle, but they're quite significant. And the differences can be quite subtle, but they're quite significant. So I think it's important to understand that. I think regulatory compliance can be complex, but founders can help with solutions. I think for example, the OFS has got a big focus on student outcomes. So universities will be thinking about strengthening connections with employers, how they provide internships, placements, those kind of things. And I know that's an area that founders are already looking at. And I think, if nothing else, awareness of those requirements will help make sure that founders are using the same language and understanding what's on institutions' minds. I spoke to a founder that was working on a tool to connect students with work placement opportunities, and they were based overseas, but they were working with English universities, and they didn't really know a lot about that operating environment. And I talked them through some of the things that the OFS were asking the universities to do in that space, and they found it really helpful in terms of aligning some of the way that they're talking with the universities about some of the things they were doing. So I think that's a sort of really important thing. And then I think lastly, obviously, come back to data. It's a really important area. And I think understanding how universities are thinking about using their data and some of the requirements on them. There's ethical and other legal and regulatory issues that universities are tackling. Does the university have a data strategy? Is that something that you're aware of when you're connecting with the university as well? And you'll know through the work that Emerge does with JISC that expectations for how data is used and managed is critical in terms of building some of those relationships. And I think that's an area where sometimes there can be a bit of dissonance in terms of where the founders and startups might be coming from and where the university is as well. So I think that's an important dimension of that broader regulatory question.
That's a great point, and particularly interesting on making sure that founders take the time to consider requirements from regulatory bodies. On the data strategy side, I'd love to know, how different are data strategies across different universities, and how can founders understand individual universities' approaches? Because when we're talking about regulatory requirements, you can look at the requirements from the regulatory body. But when it comes to data strategies, how can founders understand more about their target institutions?
Yeah, there will obviously be requirements around privacy and those kind of things which universities will be cognizant of. And also universities will have a very strong sense of their ethical and moral responsibilities in terms of the use of data. I think some universities will have data strategies which will contain some of those things, but I think the picture will be variable across different universities. And again, often the data question is something that's quite fragmented within a university. I think some of the key things to be thinking about, particularly engaging with universities, is the extent to which they're also engaging and talking to students about some of that data and how it's being used, because I think there are lots of opportunities in terms of how some of that data can be used to support learning analytics, to support better understanding of well-being and those kind of things. But I think there are some really important questions that sit behind that about how students have a voice in terms of how their data is being used and reused and those kind of things. So I think that's definitely something to look out for. Again, I think it will be quite variable in terms of having a more kind of centralized data strategy. So it's really important, I think, in talking to universities to be asking them some of those questions about data privacy and engagement with data users about how their data is actually being used within the institution.
Super interesting point on students having a voice over how their data is actually used, perhaps to improve the student experience, for example. And if there are founders that want to gain this understanding of a university strategy, who's the right stakeholder within a university to talk about their data strategies and what their challenges are there, how they're thinking about data?
It will vary from institution to institution. Often the chief operating officer will have a sort of or equivalent role within a university, will have overall responsibility for that. And often sometimes it will sit alongside that digital sort of function as well. And that's certainly, just thinking about the university I work in at the moment, a lot of those sort of questions around data do go through the chief operating officer role. But I think there's also, I guess, a question about how that is embedded, the responsibility of that is embedded across divisions and faculties and those kind of things. And I think that's where a data strategy is really important, that is cascaded and everyone knows the sort of roles and responsibilities that they have within the university as well. So sometimes some of those responsibilities can be distributed, but I think probably the sort of COO type roles are the ones where a lot of that responsibility will sit, or within their teams anyway.
Moving from the topic of stakeholders to the broader university, you touched on at the beginning how universities are very complex and regulated environments. And so sometimes for founders building a product for higher education, it can be quite difficult to, one, get to the right stakeholder, but two, know how to actually get into a university to open up discussions around their product. Given your position looking at integrating edtech solutions into universities, would love to know what the best ways or frameworks you've seen are for startups to navigate their way into a university.
Yeah, it's a really good question. It's a very perennial question. I think a lot of universities have a main entrance as such, but they don't have a front door, and it's quite difficult. There's been a lot of questions about how can businesses and those people who want to partner and engage with universities, what's the best way in? And as I've said, often things can be quite distributed across the university. I hate to say it, but I don't think there's a single answer. I think one part of the answer is about building up and cultivating relationships. So if, for example, you do have connections and network and are networked into particular parts of a university, I think there's something about how you ask questions about the wider community of people that you need to be engaging with. I think often people can come into a university and they'll have connections with one part of it. It might be within a faculty or a particular department, or even a particular area within the overall sort of organisation administration of the university, but often won't have a big understanding of how that sort of relates to the wider set of relationships that need to be developed to actually embed things. So I think asking questions of those contacts that you do have about, well, what does this mean for other parts of the university? And how are you sort of engaging and talking to other parts of the university? Because otherwise things can become quite siloed. Another thing that when I was reflecting on this, I think certainly in England, it's probably less so here in New Zealand because it's a much smaller system. But there's quite a vibrant town square. And by that, I mean, there's lots of people who network quite regularly. They meet quite regularly through conferences. There's work that Emerge does to sort of bring people together. There's work that UniversitiesUK does. You've got bodies like Wonki, and you've got the Higher Education Policy Institute, lots of conferences. And I think there is something about founders sort of being visible and present in some of those networks as well, and looking at those for opportunities to connect with people, because I think often the people who are involved in some of those networks and discussions are probably the people that you need to be linking in with and talking to as well. So I think it is a tough one. Like I said, there's not a front door you can knock on and say, who do I talk to? I think some universities are getting better at that, but I think that's something that I think is a challenge and probably needs to be worked at. I think the COO type roles which are emerging are quite important, and the people within their team. So I think that's probably something to be thinking about as well, is how to engage with that sort of community.
Great. So the key takeaway is really the focus on relationships and building those relationships.
Yeah.
One side, but on the other side, being aware of where you've built those relationships. So maybe one or two parts of a university, and there's a whole ecosystem, and it's important.
That's exactly right. Yeah,
how
yeah.
parts connect with other parts. Really interesting. You've touched on the different venues that founders can interact with and meet universities. You talked about conferences and different areas for networking. On UUK, would love to know, how can founders work with Universities UK, and can you tell us a little bit more about, one, what Universities UK does, and two, how founders might interact with UUK to bridge that gap between edtech solutions and challenges universities are facing?
I don't work at Universities UK anymore, so it's sort of more my personal view than the corporate view of UUK. But when I was there, I worked obviously closely with yourself and Nick Newman and Mary Conant-Cook and others to help connect things. We held an event just before the pandemic to bring senior leaders and founders together, and that was really successful. And I think those kind of events where you're actually bringing founders and decision makers and leaders within institutions together in the room to talk, to share ideas, to pitch, those kind of things can be really powerful, valuable. And I remember that event, hugely positive feedback and lots of connections were made. But I think bodies like JISC and others could probably help, working with Universities UK, to perhaps reignite some of those discussions. I think the sort of work that Mary Conant-Cook does through the G board, which is bringing together sort of key policy thinkers, leaders in higher education with founders, and bridging that divide between the world of edtech and the world of universities is really important. I think those kind of initiatives and bringing people into those discussions and keeping those forums live and open will be really important. And I've got a huge amount of value out of it from the university side and learned a lot as well. So I think just keeping those sort of initiatives going and keeping those forums sort of open and engaging.
Absolutely. And one thing I would add actually is something I've seen some startups do quite well is actually host their own webinars or events, bringing together contacts they've made from universities to discuss what are your current challenges and how can solutions like ourselves be solving them, and opening that up to a public forum. So I know Cadmus has hosted a few of these, for example, and they've been really, really helpful to make sure that what you're building as an edtech solution is really highly aligned with the challenges that universities are facing. Also being aware of those constraints, like you've touched on, the regulatory environment, the budget constraints, data privacy laws, and things like that. So super interesting.
Really good point. When I was at Universities UK, we often would have startups approach us about sponsoring sessions and events and webinars and those kind of things. I think we did some work with Handshake and other organizations. So I think that's a really, really good point.
Thanks, Chris. That's a really useful reminder of how founders can be proactive and actually reach out to bodies, and as they build relationships, host their own events to really dig deeper on the customer research side with universities. Let's now move into the final part of our session today, our quick fire round. So I'm going to ask you a quick question and you respond with a one-line quick response. Are you ready?
Yeah, go for it.
What's one technology that you would love to see widespread adoption of in universities?
As I mentioned earlier, I think the smart campus technology, joining up all this data and making it accessible and usable for students and staff as well, and wider communities as well that work with universities.
What's the number one misunderstood thing about the university ecosystem, in your opinion?
Notwithstanding what some of the things I've said today, I think one of the most misunderstood things is that universities aren't innovative. I think they are dealing with lots of challenges and complexity, but they want to innovate, they want to change, they want to evolve. And I think sometimes people think they don't want to, but I think they do. I think there's a strong appetite for that in the university sector.
What is your book, podcast series, or blog on education?
I'd probably get things like that I've mentioned today. I think Wonky, Happy, those kind of places. I think for higher education, there's so much great material in there, and just a great place to know what's going on and get such great insights as well. It acts a bit like a town square, and it's a great thing to see.
So if you're in your dream campus in the metaverse for a new university and you could launch the university course you wish you had access to when you were a student, what would that be?
Well, I've just moved to New Zealand, and there's a big focus here on Maori and Indigenous populations. And I think bringing some of those new technologies around AI and more edtech focus to be able to support and help people who are new to a country which has a big indigenous population, understand the culture and understand the language as well. There are lots of tools out there, but I think that's an area where there could be some real innovation as well.
What is your bold prediction for the university classroom of 2030?
I think building on the idea of the smart university, just there being a completely seamless connection between the university and the home as well. And that happens to a certain extent already, but I think really building on that and making sure that those things are completely seamless and connected.
Fantastic. I love it. Thank you so much for sharing this behind the scenes insight into the minds of universities, the kind of struggles and challenges they're facing in traditionally unsexy areas like regulation and data privacy, and how important it is for edtech startups to be aware of those areas when they support them with those challenges. Thank you so much for your time today, Chris. Really appreciate it.
No problem. Thank you.
Thanks for listening to the Emerge Product Market Fit Academy. If you enjoyed this episode, please like it, follow our channel, and if you're feeling generous, share it with a friend.